Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are tackling one of the biggest questions you can possibly ask. What is life? It sounds so simple, right? But the search for a clear definition, man, it sends us to the very edge of physics, genetics, and even philosophy. And our journey is going to start with a physicist who saw a deep and troubling paradox right at the heart of it all. So let's start with a puzzle, one that was posed way back in 1944 by the brilliant physicist Erwin Schrödinger. See, he looked at the world around him, at plants, at animals, at us, and he saw something that it didn't seem to fit with the laws of physics as he knew them. He felt like there had to be a totally different kind of mechanism at work, something special that separates the living from the non-living.
And here's the real head-scratcher at the core of his paradox. Okay, so in physics, there's this fundamental rule, right? The second law of thermodynamics. It basically says that the universe as a whole is always moving from a state of order toward disorder, towards randomness and equilibrium. But then you look at life. Life does the complete opposite. Living things are these incredible marvels of complexity and structure. They don't just hang on to order, they actively create it, seemingly out of thin air. This is what Schrödinger called order from order.
So how in the world does life pull off this amazing magic trick? Well, for the better part of a century, the go-to answer has been all about the code. The genetic information packed away inside our DNA.
The early picture of the gene it was so simple and elegant. People thought of it as this distinct little unit on a chromosome, kind of like a single bead on a string. One gene, one specific product. It made heredity seem really straightforward, almost predictable. But that tidy picture? Yeah, it wasn't going to last.
But then, as our technology got way more powerful, that neat and tidy picture just completely shattered. We found out that genes are actually fragmented. Little bits called introns get snipped out, while other parts, the exons, are spliced together. And here's the really wild part. A single stretch of DNA can be spliced in all these different ways to create a bunch of totally different proteins. So the very definition of a gene? It's not simple anymore. It's messy, it's contextual, and it really depends on the technology we're using to even look at it.
Okay, so all this complexity with the genetic code, it leads us straight to a classic biological riddle. If we're going to say life is defined by its code, then what in the world do we do about viruses?
Think about it. A living cell, it has its own metabolism. It's constantly processing energy just to stay alive, and it can reproduce all by itself. A virus? No way. It has zero metabolism. It's completely helpless until it can hijack the machinery of a host cell to make copies of itself. It's basically just a rogue piece of genetic code wrapped in a little protein code. So is having a code enough to be called life? The virus just sits right there, smack in the middle of that blurry line, challenging our whole definition.
All right, so just looking at the code isn't giving us a clear-cut answer. So let's zoom out a bit and look at the whole organism. For a long time, we've loved this metaphor of a blueprint, the idea that our DNA provides this fixed plan for building a living thing.
But here's the problem with that whole blueprint idea. A blueprint implies a fixed, unchangeable plan. It makes it sound like if you just have the genetic code, the final outcome is totally set in stone. But that completely misses a huge piece of the puzzle, the other essential partner in creating an organism, the environment it actually lives in. And there's this classic experiment with the Achillea plant that just shows this perfectly. What you're looking at here are 7 genetically identical clones. They have the exact same DNA. But even when they're grown together at a low altitude, you can already see they're growing a little differently.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting. Now we take clones from those very same parent plants and we grow them at a medium elevation. And look, the whole growth pattern just flips on its head. The plant that was the tallest before, now it's one of the shortest. It's completely unpredictable.
And then we do it again. We move them up to a high elevation, and the pattern gets totally scrambled once more. The genotype that was the star performer down at sea level is now one of the weakest. What this proves so brilliantly is that there is no such thing as a single best genetic code. A gene's success is completely 100% dependent on the environment it finds itself in.
So, here's the big takeaway from all this. Life isn't just about executing some pre-written program. It's this constant, dynamic dance between a set of genetic instructions and a world that's always changing. It's way less like a rigid blueprint and much more like a brilliant, improvised performance. And this, of course, brings up a whole other can of worms. If it's this hard to define an individual life, what happens when we try to define that fundamental category we all learned back in biology class, the species. So the most famous definition, the one most of us probably heard, comes from the biologist Ernst Mayr. It's called the biological species concept, and on the surface, it's beautifully simple. If two creatures can breed and have fertile babies, they're the same species. If they can't, they're not. Easy, right?
Well, it sounds clean and logical, but as you've probably guessed by now, nature is almost never that tidy. That simple definition starts to fall apart pretty much as soon as you start looking at the incredible diversity of life on this planet.
I mean, think about it. What do you do with the entire world of bacteria, which just reproduce by splitting in two? Or fossils? We can't exactly get a T-Rex and a Triceratops to try and breed. And then you've got countless plants and even some animals that hybridize with other groups all the time. The biological species concept, for all its elegance, it doesn't work for a huge chunk of life.
So this messy reality has led a lot of scientists to an idea called taxonomic pluralism. And really all it means is that maybe we should just stop looking for one single, perfect, universal definition of a species. Maybe we should just accept that different forces, genetics, ecology, how they reproduce, they all carve up the tree of life in different ways. And we might just need different definitions for different situations.
Okay, so let's recap. We've hit the limits of trying to define life by its code. We've seen the problems with defining it by its physical form, or even by neatly slotting it into species. Maybe the problem is that we've been asking the question the wrong way all along. What if life isn't a thing? A noun with a checklist of properties you can just tick off. What if life is a verb? What if it's defined not by what it is, but by what it does?
And there are two really cool ideas that help us think this way. First is something called autopoiesis. It's a mouthful, I know, but it just means that life is a system that is constantly building and repairing itself from the inside. And second, life is what physicists call a dissipative structure. The best way to picture this is like a whirlpool in a river. It holds its shape, right? But it only does that by constantly taking in new water and energy and spitting out chaos.
And this brings us full circle right back to Schrödinger's big puzzle about order versus disorder. See, a living system doesn't actually violate that second law of thermodynamics. No, it plays this really clever game. It creates this little bubble of order for itself, but it does it by increasing the disorder, the chaos, of the universe around it.
Let's stick with that whirlpool metaphor. A living thing, or even an entire ecosystem. It's like a stable little eddy in a giant river of energy flowing through the universe. It maintains its incredibly complex structure precisely because that structure is super efficient at grabbing high-quality energy, using it, and then spitting out low-grade heat and waste. It literally exports its disorder so it can keep its own internal order. So where does that leave us? Well, with a final, kind of profound thought. We started this whole journey looking for life as if it were some thing out there to be discovered, like finding a new element on the periodic table. But what if it's not? What if life is actually a concept that we, as humans, are constantly creating and refining as we learn more? And if that's true, then maybe the real goal isn't to find a final stamped and sealed answer, but to just keep appreciating the amazing evolving journey of asking the question itself.